Hey everyone, I'm currently driving 1,200 kilometers to Italy just to get better at flying RC helicopters. 4 helis, 5 days of flight training and hopefully no crash. With me is my wingman Lucas.
What?
And we've still got another 600 kilometers to go. So why am I even doing this? If I'm being honest, I probably could have spent the money for this trip on another helicopter. I've been flying RC helicopters for about 5 years now. And lately I've had this feeling that I've hit a plateau. Loops, rolls, stall turns, even a bit of inverted flying, that's all comfortable. But if I'm honest, the only place I've really been improving is on the simulator, not in the real world. So I started asking myself one simple question. Can 1 week of professional flight training improve my flying more than buying another helicopter? And while we're at it, can it please stop raining? Either way, this is either going to be the biggest step forward I've ever made as a pilot or the most expensive short vacation of my life. Let's find out. After driving through rain almost the entire way from Germany to Italy, the first morning finally looked a little bit more promising. There were still plenty of clouds hanging over the mountains, but at least it stayed dry. And here we were, a small village in South Tyrol, surrounded by mountains. Our hotel sat on the side of a hill, which actually turned out to be pretty convenient. If one of us made a mistake while flying, we had quite a bit of extra safety margin below the flight line. Unfortunately, that doesn't help if you accidentally hit the motor switch during flight. And that's exactly what happened to Lucas on his very first flight. The plan had been to spend the morning getting comfortable before the training started. Instead, we watched his logo perform an unplanned auto-rotation straight into the hillside. At that moment, we both thought the exact same thing. Well, that's it. The trip has ended before it even began. Luckily, our hotel owner turned out to be an RC helicopter pilot himself. Together, we managed to get the logo flying again. The pushrod from a T-Rex 450 became an emergency replacement. The landing gear was glued back together and the tail boom earned a slide bend that would stay with it for the rest of the week. Less than an hour later, the helicopter was back in the air. Around noon, our instructor Daniel from Heli School Gonzales arrived. Before we even started flying, he spent quite some time going through our helicopters. His goal was simple: get the most out of every setup by properly tuning the flybarless system. If you're interested in how he does that, he actually made a detailed video about the process. I leave a link down in the description. And I have to say, our helicopters had never flown this well before. Only then did the actual training begin. First, Daniel wanted to see where we were as pilots. We flew a few normal flights and afterwards we talked about our individual goals for the week. For me, the biggest goal was building the confidence to try new maneuvers and hopefully taking my first real steps towards learning pyro flips. Lucas wanted to improve something completely different: smoother, cleaner and more precise forward flight. One thing I really liked about Daniel's teaching was how flexible it was. Depending on the exercise, he'd either hand over the entire helicopter or just individual controls, so we could isolate very specific movements without having to think about everything else at the same time. And that's where the first big lesson happened to me. For years, I'd been managing collective pitch completely wrong. Before every flip, I instinctively lightened the helicopter with a little bit of extra collective, thinking it would make the maneuver easier. Instead, Daniel taught me to fly with deliberate, precise collective inputs without constantly correcting myself afterwards. It sounds like such a small detail, but looking back, it became the foundation for almost everything I learned during the rest of the week. We started the morning by dialing in my scale helicopter. And honestly, I was pretty amazed by what Daniel managed to get out of it. By the end of the setup session, my scale machine was happily doing rolls, something I would have never expected from what I've always considered to be a slow, heavy cruiser. Daniel did notice one thing though. The helicopter only really came alive at around 96% throttle, so at some point I'll probably have to think about converting it from 6S to 7S. Next, we moved on to our transmitters. Out of the box, the collective stick on my radio was simply too light. During small tail corrections, it was way too easy to add unwanted collective without even noticing it. We also adjusted the spring tension on the cyclic stick. They are tiny changes, but those little details add up. While day 1 was mostly about getting comfortable, day 2 got a lot more technical. Or to be more specific, turns. Sounds pretty boring, right? Turns out it wasn't boring at all. Our goal was to fly perfectly smooth circles using only elevator and rudder. Whenever the helicopter started losing altitude, the answer wasn't to throw in some aileron. Instead, Daniel taught us how to guide the helicopter properly with the tail. It's a subtle technique, but it's also the foundation for clean, high-speed circuits later on. Up until that point, I honestly thought my turns were pretty decent. Sure, they looked smooth enough, but Daniel quickly pointed out that I had been compensating for small mistakes without even realizing it, instead of flying the helicopter correctly. And that's really the story of the entire week. I'm not just learning new maneuvers. I'm learning stuff that I've been doing for years properly. Sometimes that's a little humbling, but that's exactly why I came here. Between all this serious training, we also had some fun. I spent some time working on the Möbius and practiced the Cuban 8, a maneuver that looks fairly harmless until you actually try to fly it. Every now and then, a little bit of light rain drifted across the field. It never really bothered us. Our sun umbrella simply became a rain umbrella, and training carried on as if nothing had happened. Every evening, we'd sit all together in the hotel restaurant, replay the day in our heads and talk helicopter for hours. Looking back, those conversations were almost as valuable as the actual flying. Finally, summer arrived. Blue skies, sunshine, and perfect flying weather. For me, this was easily the biggest breakthrough of the entire week. I learned overspeeds and spent more time working on the Möbius, and finally completed my very first full pyro flip. That was one of those moments that makes the entire trip worthwhile. While I was chasing new maneuvers, Lukas had a very different mission. Turns, circles, more turns, even more circles. By the way, throughout the entire week we trained using Daniel's Spectre Ultimate V2. I've flown quite a few helicopters over the years, but this one was something special. It felt incredibly precise while still being easy to fly, and consistently delivered flight times of well over 15 minutes. According to Daniel, that comes down to having a perfectly matched setup. If you're curious, the helicopter is powered by an X-Nova 4025 with 560 kV, an YGE Aureus 135 and Venture Sport Blades 716. Those long flight times were fantastic, because there was never any pressure to rush any exercise before the battery ran out. Although I have to admit, after 15 minutes of full concentration, I was actually hoping for the low voltage alarm to finally go off. Your brain definitely gets a workout here. And after dinner, we still weren't done. We met again in the classroom and continued practicing on the simulator. Daniel showed us several exercises specifically designed to improve stick precision and build better muscle memory. From breakfast until bedtime, everything revolved around RC helicopters. By day 4, our little group had grown. 2 more pilots had joined us, bringing the total to 4. Whenever we weren't flying, we were usually back on the simulator or talking about the setup and maintenance. One session that really stood out to me was Daniel showing us how to use Mikado's vibration analysis. But there was another realization that day, one I wasn't expecting. I noticed that I had become much less sensitive to less than perfect flying conditions. We flew from morning until evening. Wind, bright overcast skies where you could barely make up the helicopter, harsh backlighting, everything. A few days earlier, I would have probably waited for better weather. Now I simply focus on my flying. And I think that's part of becoming a better pilot too. The final day was all about putting everything together. For me, that meant more work on half and full pyro flips. Meanwhile, Lukas finally received the replacement servo he had been waiting for. That meant his ill-goblin KSE could finally be completed and flown. And I have to say, that 3-blade setup was seriously impressive. Even Daniel, who normally prefers 2-blade helicopters, was really impressed by how well it flew. Before we knew it, the week was over. Time for a conclusion. Whether I'm actually a better pilot is something I'll probably only realize over the next few months. Some of the progress I've made probably hasn't even sunk in yet. But one thing has already changed. When I arrived here, I honestly believed my helicopter was perfectly dialed in. After several batteries on Daniel's training helicopter, I went back to my own mission. And suddenly it felt soft, sluggish, almost imprecise. Not because my helicopter had gotten worse, but because my understanding of what a properly tuned helicopter should feel like had completely changed. The same thing happened with my flying. I finally started practicing maneuvers I'd been putting off for years. More importantly, I'm going home with a whole collection of exercises that will probably keep me busy for the rest of the summer. But if I'm honest, what I probably remember the most isn't a single maneuver, it's the atmosphere. For one entire week, life revolved around RC helicopters. Flying, learning, talking setups, flying the simulator, sharing dinner, and then the next morning getting up and doing it all over again. Honestly, that was good for the soul. I can absolutely see myself doing another training camp like this in a couple of years. Although next time I'd probably book a few simulator coaching sessions beforehand. That way, I would already know my biggest weaknesses before arriving, and I could spend even more time working on new maneuvers and smooth transitions between them, because that's definitely the next challenge waiting for me. And that brings us back to the question I asked at the very beginning. Was this week of flight training worth it? I'd say absolutely. Not because I suddenly came home flying every maneuver, and not because I became a completely different pilot in just 5 days. It was worth it because I realized something much more important. Real progress isn't always about learning something new. Sometimes it's about questioning the habits you've built over years and finally learning to do the basics the right way. That's what made this trip worth every mile. So, now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever taken professional RC helicopter flight training? Or is it something you've been thinking about? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.